The emergency alarm blared through the Galactic Council's grand chamber, its piercing sound echoing off the marble-like walls. Hundreds of alien representatives rushed to their seats, their usual ceremonial entrance forgotten in the face of unprecedented danger. High Counselor Reed, Earth's representative, sat quietly observing the chaos. Unlike his alien counterparts, who moved with frantic energy, he maintained a calm demeanor learned from years of diplomatic service. This was his first year representing humanity in the Council, and he had never seen such panic before. "The swarm has breached the outer defense line," announced First Speaker Smith, his holographic form flickering above the central platform. "The Bright Empire has fallen. Their 40,000 ships, gone in hours." Gasps filled the chamber. The Bright Empire had been one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, with technology centuries ahead of Earth's capabilities. "Show us," Reed requested, his voice cutting through the noise. The chamber darkened, and a massive hologram appeared. What Reed saw made his blood run cold. A massive cloud of biological ships, looking like a mixture of insects and organic spacecraft, moved through space like a plague of locusts. They consumed everything in their path: ships, stations, even small moons, converting all matter into more of themselves. "The Bright Empire's final transmission," Smith said, activating another recording. The hologram showed alien soldiers, tall and elegant in their advanced armor, retreating from their positions. Their weapons, capable of destroying small moons, seemed to barely scratch the smaller swarm creatures that poured through their defenses. "We cannot stop them," the alien commander reported, his voice translated for all to understand. "Retreat. Retreat to the inner worlds." Those were his final words before the transmission cut to static. Reed watched the footage again, his military training from years ago kicking in. Something caught his eye. "Play it again," he requested, "but slow down the combat footage." The council members looked at him strangely, but Smith complied. Reed leaned forward, studying the swarm's movement patterns. They were fast, yes, and numerous beyond counting. "But they're not that tough," Reed muttered, drawing surprised looks from nearby representatives. "Not that tough," a blue-skinned diplomat sputtered. "They destroyed the Bright Empire. The Diamond Concordat fell in days. Even the Ancient Collective is running." Reed stood up, his voice firm. "I see advanced civilizations fighting like they're still in their golden halls. I see soldiers retreating at the first sign of close combat. I see weapons designed for ship-to-ship combat being used against small, fast-moving targets." He paused, looking around the chamber. "What I don't see is anyone standing their ground and fighting back properly. And I suppose humans would do better?" someone asked mockingly. Reed smiled, remembering his own days in the service. "We have a group of warriors who specialize in exactly this type of fight. They're called Marines." He pressed a button on his console, sending a message back to Earth. The response came quickly, and Reed's smile grew wider. "The Earth government has just authorized the deployment of the Marine Corps to combat the swarm threat," he announced. "We're not running. We're going to fight." The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. The representative from the Stellar Unity actually fainted. "You're going to fight?" Smith asked incredulously. "Your species barely has interstellar travel. Your weapons are centuries behind the Bright Empire's technology. This is suicide." Reed thought about the Marines he had served with, about their training, their determination, their ability to adapt and overcome. "Maybe," he replied. "But there's something you should know about humans, especially Marines. We don't run from a fight. And sometimes that makes all the difference." As the council chamber dissolved into chaos, Reed sent another message to Earth. "Get the Marines ready. We're going to need every devil dog we've got." The swarm was about to learn a very important lesson. Not everyone runs. Sometimes you meet an enemy that stands their ground. And the United States Marine Corps hadn't retreated in over 400 years. They weren't about to start now. 2 weeks after the council meeting, Colonel Bill watched the holographic display with intense focus. Around him, in the newly established Marine Command Center on Mars base, dozens of officers studied footage from fallen alien worlds. "Play it again," he ordered, pointing at a specific battle sequence. "Focus on how the swarm reacts to direct hits." The footage showed a massive alien warship firing its main weapons at the biological swarm ships. The energy beams cut through several creatures, but the swarm barely slowed down. Instead, they simply filled the gaps with more bodies. "Sir," called Lieutenant Jack from his station. "New data from the Diamond Concordat's last stand." The main screen switched to fresh footage. This time, the alien defenders had set up massive energy walls around their capital world. The swarm crashed against these barriers like waves against a shore. For a moment, it seemed to work. Then the swarm did something unexpected. They started piling on top of each other, building living mountains of bodies until they spilled over the top of the energy walls. Pause there. Colonel Bill stood up, excitement in his voice. "Look at their behavior. They're acting exactly like insects from Earth. They don't think like individuals." The other Marines gathered around, their training helping them see what their commander had noticed. The swarm wasn't using advanced tactics or strategy. They were operating on pure instinct, like ants or termites. "The aliens have been fighting them wrong this whole time," Bill continued. "They're using big guns and defensive walls against what's basically a giant nest of space bugs." Major Tom, the head of tactical analysis, stepped forward. "What's your thinking, sir?" Bill smiled grimly. "When you have an insect problem, you don't try to kill every bug. You go for the queen." The command center burst into activity. Marines gathered around various screens, their centuries of pest control and combat experience combining into something the galaxy had never seen before. "Sir," called another officer, "the swarm just broke through the ancient collective's lines. Their entire defense fleet is retreating." The news wasn't surprising. The ancient collective, despite their advanced technology, had followed the same failed strategy as everyone else. "Set up defensive lines and try to hold position. Get me a direct line to Earth Command," Bill ordered. "I know how we can beat these bugs." Minutes later, he stood before a screen filled with military leaders and government officials. His plan was simple, the kind of straightforward thinking that Marines were famous for. "The swarm is acting like a giant colony of space insects," he explained. "Every insect colony has a queen. Find her, kill her, and the whole colony falls apart. We don't need bigger guns or stronger shields. We need boarding parties." The room fell silent. Even on Earth, the idea of purposely boarding swarm ships seemed insane. "You want to send Marines into those things?" asked one general in disbelief. "That's exactly what I want to do," Bill replied firmly. "The aliens keep retreating because they're afraid of close combat. But that's where Marines excel. We go in, find the queen, and eliminate her." Simple as that. There was more silence. Then one of the older generals began to laugh. Only the Marines would look at an unstoppable alien swarm and think, "Yeah, we can handle this with basic pest control." The plan was approved within the hour. Across the solar system, Marine units began preparing for the biggest extermination job in human history. They'd modified their combat suits for space warfare, adapted their weapons for close quarters battle, and studied every piece of footage they could find. In his office, Colonel Bill wrote what would become a famous entry in his personal log. "The galaxy thinks the swarm is unstoppable because everyone keeps running away. But Marines don't run. We're about to teach these bugs that when you corner a Marine, you're the one in trouble." The stage was set. For the first time since they appeared, the swarm was about to face an enemy that wouldn't retreat. The Marines were going hunting, and they had pest control down to a science. The training room on Mars base echoed with the sound of boots hitting metal floors. Captain Mark stood watching his Marines run through another practice session, their movements precise and controlled despite wearing the new heavy space combat suits. "Move like you mean it," he shouted as the Marines practiced boarding procedures. The swarm won't wait for you to catch your breath. The training area had been specially designed to mimic the inside of a swarm ship based on the limited footage they had. The walls were covered with a material that felt like the organic corridors of the alien vessels. The lighting was kept dim, and speakers played the horrible shrieking sounds that survivors had described. Team 1, breach point clear, called out Sergeant Pete as his squad secured their practice zone. They moved differently from traditional space forces, where others relied on fancy technology. The Marines kept it simple: shotguns, flame units, and good old-fashioned explosives. Above the training area, a group of alien observers watched in shocked silence. They had come to Mars expecting to see advanced weapons or revolutionary tactics. Instead, they watched humans practicing what looked like basic extermination techniques. "I don't understand," said one alien diplomat to Captain Mark. "Your weapons are so primitive." Mark smiled. "Sometimes the old ways work best. We've been killing bugs on Earth for thousands of years. The principles haven't changed just because these bugs are bigger and in space." Down in the training area, the Marines were practicing their new favorite weapon: modified flamethrowers designed for space combat. The aliens had never considered using fire in space battles, but the Marines knew that even in space, bugs hate fire. "Sir," called Lieutenant Dan from the communications room. "New reports from the front. The swarm just took 3 more systems from the ancient collective." Mark nodded grimly. They were running out of time. The swarm was moving faster now, growing with each world they consumed. But that also meant they were getting closer to Earth, closer to where the Marines wanted them. In another part of the base, technicians were modifying Marine drop pods. The small, sturdy vessels were perfect for punching through the swarm's organic hulls. They didn't need to be fancy. They just needed to get Marines inside the enemy ships. "How are the suits coming along?" Mark asked the chief technician. "Ready to go, sir," she replied. "We've added the acid resistance you requested. Not as fancy as alien armor, but it'll keep the Marines alive long enough to do their job." That was the key difference between human and alien preparations. The aliens focused on running away and building better shields. The Marines focused on getting close and hitting hard. During meal breaks, Mark would often find his Marines studying footage of Earth insects. They learned how ant colonies worked, how termites built their nests, and most importantly, how to find the queen in any hive. This wasn't just a war. It was pest control on a galactic scale. "Sir," Sergeant Pete approached with news from Earth. "The alien refugees are asking why we're not evacuating our civilians. They think we're crazy for staying." Mark looked at the training room, where his Marines were still practicing, still improving, even after 12 straight hours. "Tell them that humans don't give up their homes to bugs. Not on Earth, and not in space." As the day ended, Mark received a priority message from command. The swarm had changed course. They were heading directly for the Sol system, probably attracted by all the life signs they detected. "Perfect," Mark said to himself. "Let them come." In his daily report, he wrote words that would later become famous throughout the galaxy. "The aliens think we're crazy for not running. They don't understand that Marines have been dealing with hostile invasive species since before we left Earth. The swarm isn't an unstoppable army. They're just pests that have gotten too big for their own good. And Marines are very, very good at pest control." The final preparations were almost complete. Soon, the swarm would learn why you should never corner a Marine. The radar room on Jupiter Station was dead quiet. Lieutenant Jim watched the screens as millions of red dots appeared at the edge of the solar system. The swarm had arrived. "They're here," he announced over the base-wide speaker. No one panicked. No one ran. The Marines had been waiting for this moment. Colonel Bill's voice came over the command channel. "All units, battle stations, remember your training. These are just bugs. Big bugs, space bugs, but still just bugs." The alien refugees on the station watched in disbelief as Marines calmly walked to their positions. Instead of evacuating, the humans were advancing toward the threat. First wave of swarm ships entering Jupiter's orbit, reported the radar officer. Numbers, too many to count, sir. In space, the sight was terrifying. The swarm darkened the stars, their biological ships moving like a cloud of locusts. They had grown enormous after consuming so many worlds. Their confidence was clear in how they moved. They expected no real resistance. They were wrong. Launch the first wave, ordered Colonel Bill. Show these bugs how Marines fight. Hundreds of small armored pods shot out from hidden bases on Jupiter's moons. Each pod contained 4 Marines in special combat suits. The pods looked tiny compared to the massive swarm ships, but they moved with purpose. Impact in 10 seconds, called Sergeant Pete from the lead pod. Remember, aim for the soft spots. The swarm never expected such a direct attack. They were used to enemies who stayed far away and fired big weapons. But now humans were purposely flying into their ships. The pods struck like bullets, punching through the organic hulls of the swarm vessels. Inside his pod, Private Joe felt the impact, then the burning as their pod's special coating melted through the alien flesh. Breach successful, he reported, checking his shotgun. Beginning Operation Pest Control. Inside the swarm ships, the Marines found exactly what they expected: organic corridors that looked like giant insect nests. Their training in the mock-up spaces had prepared them perfectly. Movement ahead, warned Corporal Bob, raising his flamethrower. When the first wave of smaller swarm creatures came around the corner, they met a wall of fire. The aliens screamed. No one had ever brought fire into their ships before. On Jupiter Station, the alien refugees watched the battle screens in amazement. The tiny human dots were actually advancing deeper into the swarm ships. No species had ever managed that before. Second wave, launch, ordered Colonel Bill. More pods shot out, targeting different swarm ships. The Marines had learned from Earth insects. You had to attack multiple parts of the nest at once. Lieutenant Jim's voice came over the radio from inside one of the swarm ships. "Sir, you were right. They're running on instinct. They don't know how to fight inside their own ships." The swarm creatures were dangerous in space battles, but in close combat, they were meeting an enemy with thousands of years of experience in killing bugs. Every Marine was using skills passed down through generations of fighting Earth's most persistent pests. Found a central nerve cluster, reported Sergeant Pete's team. Setting charges now. One of the massive swarm ships suddenly convulsed as the Marines detonated their explosives deep inside it. The huge vessel began breaking apart, its smaller creatures flying around in confusion. "That's how you do it, Marines," shouted Colonel Bill. "Target those nerve centers." The alien refugees were shocked to hear laughter on the Marine radio channels. The humans were actually enjoying this fight. Where every other species saw unstoppable monsters, the Marines saw just another infestation to clean out. As the battle raged on, Colonel Bill sent a message to Earth. First phase successful. The swarm never expected anyone to fight them from the inside. They're about to learn why Marines have been Earth's exterminators since 1775. Semper Fi. The swarm was finally facing an enemy that didn't just stand their ground. They attacked. And every Marine knew, when dealing with bugs, you had to hit them where they lived. Inside the largest swarm ship, Captain Mark's team moved through the organic corridors, their boots sticking slightly to the living floor. The air smelled like a mixture of rotten eggs and burning meat. Their flamethrowers had been busy. Movement above, warned Private Joe, pointing his light at the ceiling. The organic walls were pulsing faster now, like an angry heartbeat. "They're learning," said Mark, pumping his shotgun. "They're finally figuring out they need to defend the inside of their ships." Swarm creatures dropped from hidden holes in the ceiling, their claws clicking against their natural armor. But the Marines were ready. Shotguns roared in the enclosed space, and the creatures fell. "Save the flames," ordered Mark. "We'll need them when we find the big nest." Through their radio, they could hear other Marine teams reporting success across different swarm ships. Every team had the same mission: find the central chamber, locate the Queen, and end this invasion once and for all. "Sir," called Sergeant Pete through the radio, "we found something different. This whole ship, it's like one giant nervous system." Mark smiled behind his helmet. That matched what they knew about Earth insects. The whole colony acted as one body, one mind. The Marines weren't just fighting separate ships. They were fighting parts of one massive organism. "All teams," he commanded, "switched to Channel 3. Pete found our target." The Marine teams began converging on what they now realized was the central ship. But the swarm had finally understood the danger. Thousands of warrior creatures poured out of the walls, trying to stop the humans from reaching their Queen. "Hold the line," shouted Mark as his team set up a defensive position. Their shotguns and flamethrowers created a killing zone in the organic corridor. The swarm creatures were tough, but in close combat, Marine weapons were tougher. Private Joe got grabbed by a creature and pulled toward a wall. Instead of panicking, he pulled out his combat knife, standard Marine issue, nothing fancy, and stabbed into the creature's eye. The alien screamed and dropped him. "That's it, Marines," Mark encouraged. "They bleed just like any other bug." Through the radio, they could hear similar fights happening throughout the ship. The Marines were pushing forward, corridor by corridor, treating this like the world's biggest bug hunt. "Sir," called Lieutenant Jim's voice over the radio, "we found something big. Sending coordinates now." Mark checked his helmet display. Jim's team had found a massive chamber near the center of the ship. The readings showed something huge inside, probably the Queen they were looking for. "All teams, converge on Jim's position," ordered Mark. "Time to end this pest problem." The Marines fought their way through the living ship, using everything they'd learned about fighting insects. When the corridors got too crowded with enemies, they burned them out. When the swarm tried to ambush from above, they filled the ceiling with shotgun shells. "They're getting desperate," noticed Sergeant Pete as more and more creatures attacked them. "We must be getting close." Finally, Mark's team reached the massive chamber. Other Marine teams arrived from different corridors, all of them showing signs of heavy fighting but still standing strong. "Look at that," whispered Private Joe, pointing at the center of the chamber. There, suspended in a web of organic cables and pulsing flesh, was something that looked like a mix between an insect queen and a spaceship. It was huge, easily the size of a small building. "That's what we came for, Marines," said Mark, checking his weapons. "The biggest bug we've ever hunted." The Queen sensed them. The entire chamber shook as she screamed, calling all her warriors to defend her. The Marines could hear thousands of creatures heading their way. "Well," said Mark, lighting up his flamethrower, "I guess the bugs want to do this the hard way." He looked at his teams, all of them ready for the fight of their lives. "Let's show them why you don't mess with Marine pest control." The final battle was about to begin, and the fate of the galaxy would depend on a bunch of humans who simply refused to run from a bug problem. The Queen's chamber shook with the sound of combat. Captain Mark ducked behind a fleshy column as acid sprayed past him. Around the massive room, Marines fought against waves of swarm warriors protecting their Queen. "Keep that fire up," he shouted as Private Joe used his flamethrower to clear a path. The flames made the organic walls shrink back, creating temporary safe zones in the living ship. The Queen towered above them, her massive form pulsing with anger. She was bigger than anything they'd expected, like a giant wasp mixed with a spaceship. Every few seconds, she would scream, and more warriors would burst from the walls to attack. "Running low on ammo," called Sergeant Pete, his shotgun booming in the enclosed space. The Marines had prepared for a long fight, but this was testing their limits. "Make every shot count," Mark ordered. He watched as his Marines moved in practiced formation, protecting each other while pushing forward. Years of training was paying off. They fought like one unit, just like they'd been taught. Lieutenant Jim's voice crackled over the radio. "Sir, we found something. The floor under the Queen. It's softer than the rest. Mark smiled. Just like on Earth, Bug Queens always had a weak spot. All teams, he commanded, focus fire on the support structures. Let's bring her down to our level. The Marines adjusted their strategy. Instead of fighting directly against the warrior swarms, they began targeting the organic pillars holding the Queen above them. Their shotguns and explosives tore into the living flesh of the ship. The Queen seemed to realize what they were doing. She screamed louder, and the entire chamber began to move. The walls tried to close in on the Marines, but their flamethrowers kept the living tissue at bay. "Watch your backs," warned Private Joe as more warriors dropped from above. But the Marines were ready. Back to back, they formed defensive circles, their weapons creating zones of death around them. "Sir," called another Marine, "our charges are set on the main supports." Mark nodded. This was their chance. "All teams, get ready to move. When she falls, hit her with everything we've got." The explosives detonated, and the chamber filled with the screech of tearing flesh. The Queen's support structures collapsed, and the massive creature crashed down to the chamber floor. The impact shook the entire ship. "Now," shouted Mark, "push forward." The Marines charged, using the Queen's confusion to get closer. Their weapons, designed for close combat, finally had a clear shot at the main target. The Queen thrashed, trying to regain control, but the Marines were too close now. "Aim for her joints," Mark ordered, remembering their studies of Earth insects. "Just like a regular bug, take out the legs first." The Marines concentrated their fire. The Queen was tough, but she had never faced enemies who knew exactly where to shoot. Her armored shell might stop alien energy weapons, but Marine shotguns at point-blank range were different. "She's weakening," called Surgeon Pete. The Queen's movements were becoming slower, more desperate. The constant fire from the Marines was wearing her down. But the fight wasn't over. The Queen had one last defense. She began releasing some kind of spores into the air. The Marines' suit filters caught most of it, but the cloud was getting thicker. "Can't see," reported Private Joe, his voice tense. The spores were everywhere, making it hard to aim. Mark knew they had to end this now. "All flamethrowers," he commanded. "Burn the air, just like smoking out a wasp nest." The Marines with flamethrowers stepped forward, their weapons igniting the spore cloud. The chamber lit up like a sun as the spores caught fire. The Queen screamed in pain as the flames reached her. "Push," Mark shouted over the roar of the fire. "Push now. Show this oversized bug why Marines always get their target." The final phase of the battle had begun. Everything they'd fought for came down to this moment. And the Marines, true to their nature, didn't hesitate. They pushed forward into the flames, toward their target, ready to end this fight once and for all. The flames died down in the Queen's chamber, revealing the scene of the final battle. Captain Mark stood with his remaining Marines, their armor scorched and dented, but still standing. In the center of the room lay the massive form of the Swarm Queen, finally still. "Status report," Mark called out, his voice rough from shouting orders. "She's dead, sir," reported Private Joe, scanning the Queen's body with his suit sensors. "No life signs, just like any other bug when you hit it hard enough." Around them, they could feel the entire ship shuddering. Without the Queen's control, the living vessel was starting to fall apart. Through their radio, reports came in from other Marine teams across the swarm fleet. "Sir," Lieutenant Jim's voice crackled through the comm. "The other ships, they're stopping. The smaller creatures are just freezing in place." Mark smiled behind his helmet. "Just as they'd predicted, kill the Queen, and the colony dies." "All teams," he ordered, "begin evacuation. Our job here is done." As the Marines made their way back to their extraction points, they could see the swarm falling apart. The massive fleet that had terrified the galaxy was now just a collection of dying creatures, their connection to the Queen severed. Back on Jupiter Station, Colonel Bill watched the sensor readings with satisfaction. The swarm ships were drifting, their biological forms already starting to break down in space. "Send word to Earth," he ordered. "Tell them the bug hunt was successful." The alien refugees on the station couldn't believe their eyes. The swarm, which had destroyed their mighty civilizations, had been defeated by humans using what they considered primitive weapons and basic tactics. "How?" one alien diplomat asked Bill. "How did you know this would work?" Bill shrugged. "We've been dealing with insects since we first walked out of our caves. The bigger they are, the harder they fall, but bugs are still bugs." News of the victory spread across the galaxy. The fleeing alien civilizations stopped their retreat, turning their ships around to see the impossible. The swarm, which had consumed countless worlds, had been stopped by the Marines of a young spacefaring race. 2 days later, in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council, High Counselor Reed stood before the assembled representatives. The room was packed. Every species wanted to hear how humans had accomplished the impossible. "The secret," Reed explained, "wasn't in having better technology or stronger weapons. It was in understanding your enemy. The swarm wasn't an unstoppable force. It was just a big pest problem. And Marines have been handling pest problems since 1775. Captain Mark and his team were honored in the chamber, their scorched armor and simple weapons drawing curious looks from the alien representatives. To everyone's surprise, the Marines seemed almost casual about their victory. "Just doing our job," Mark said when asked about their bravery. "Marines don't run from a fight, no matter how big the bug is." In the years that followed, other species began sending their warriors to train with the Marines. They wanted to learn the human way of fighting, the determination to stand ground, the ability to adapt, and most importantly, the courage to face any enemy head-on. The remaining pieces of the swarm were cleaned up by joint human-alien extermination teams. The Marines shared their techniques, teaching others how to handle similar threats in the future. Back on Earth, in the Marine Corps Museum, they added a new display, a piece of the Queen's armor, mounted next to a simple Marine Corps insignia. Below it, they placed a small plaque with words that would become famous across the galaxy. "When the mighty ran, Marines stood their ground. When the advanced retreated, Marines pushed forward. When the galaxy faced its darkest hour, Marines did what they've always done. They found the biggest bug in the universe, and they exterminated it. Semper Fidelis." The galaxy had learned an important lesson. Sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. And when you have a pest problem, no matter how big, call the Marines.